There was a man who lived among the exiles in the imposing city of Susa, capital of the vast Persian Empire. His name was Mordecai, from the tribe of Benjamin, a direct descendant of Kish and Shimei, of the lineage of Saul. He carried in his history the marks of a broken and scattered nation. The echoes of Jerusalem still lived in his memory, even though he himself may never have set foot in his ancestral land. Mordecai was a Jew in a foreign land, not by choice, but as a consequence of the decisions and downfalls of the past. His ancestors had been taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar, and now he lived under a new empire, among new masters. But even though the walls of Jerusalem were far away, the God of Israel remained close, and it was to this God that Mordecai clung firmly. In Susa, many Jews tried to adapt, camouflaging their beliefs, their customs, their origins. But Mordecai stood firm. It was not a matter of rebellion or pride, but of identity. He knew who he was, he knew where he came from, and he knew who he believed in. He did not bow down to the Persian gods, nor did he surrender to the whims of the dominant culture. He was a man of quiet demeanor, but of unshakable convictions. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. He lived in the shadow of the palaces, far from the decisions that shaped the empire. He was one among many, but God often looks at the one among many and makes them key players in his eternal plans. Mordecai's heart beat with the hope of seeing his people restored. Even in silence, he prayed. Even among the stones of dispersion, he waited for the time of harvest. His faith was discreet, but alive, and it was in this strange land, among corridors of power and streets of oppression, that Mordecai began to write, without knowing it, the first steps of a story that would change the destiny of an entire nation. In the heart of Susa, far from the eyes of the world, God was preparing a righteous man, someone who, even though anonymous, already walked with the dignity of those who belong to the eternal kingdom. Before continuing, I want to invite you to comment on which city or country you are watching from. Let's see how far this message is reaching. Among the many exiles living in Susa was a young woman named Hadassah. Her parents had died when she was still a child, leaving her an orphan in a foreign land. She was a sweet girl, with serene beauty and eyes that carried a deep silence, shaped by loss and longing. Although her origins were humble, her soul carried a unique grace. Mordecai, her older relative, took responsibility for her, not out of obligation, but out of love. He raised Hadassah as if she were his own daughter. He gave her not only shelter and food, but also values, advice, and faith. In his home, he taught her about the God of Israel, the God who, even when all seemed lost, continued to care for his people. He called her Esther. It was a Persian name, perhaps to protect her, perhaps to give her some chance of being accepted in that strange world. But inside, Hadassah never ceased to exist. Esther was what the world saw. Hadassah was what heaven knew. The days passed, and the girl grew up. Mordecai watched with a heart full of hope as the one he considered his daughter blossomed. It was not only her beauty that attracted attention, but her gentleness, her precocious wisdom, her way of listening with respect and speaking softly. In every gesture, there was the mark of someone shaped by Mordecai's care and discreet but firm presence. Even without wealth or position, Esther grew up with dignity. She learned to move with prudence, to remain silent when necessary, and to speak with courage when the moment called for it. Mordecai knew that at some point God would use this young woman, but he had no idea how. Between simple walls and whispered prayers, a deep relationship of trust formed between the two. Mordecai was her guide, her anchor, her mirror of faith. And Esther, even when she arrived at the palace halls, would carry with her the teachings and steadfastness of the one who had given her a family. Unbeknownst to him, Mordecai's care for that orphan would be the key to the preservation of an entire people. In the heart of the palace of Susa, the throne of the empire was incomplete. Queen Vashti had been deposed after refusing to obey an order from the king, and the absence of a sovereign caused unrest in the corridors of power. The king's advisors suggested an unusual solution: gather the most beautiful young women in the kingdom so that the king could choose his new queen from among them. Esther was one of the young women taken to the royal harem. The decision was not hers, but the king's decree. When he received the news, Mordecai was silent for a moment. He knew he could not stop her, but he also knew that this path could be dangerous. Wisely, he advised her not to reveal her Jewish origins. It was advice meant to protect her, but it also set the stage for something greater. She took with her only her faith, her dignity, and Mordecai's teachings. In the palace, she faced a new world, one of protocols, appearances, intrigues, and games of influence. But even there, her presence stood out. She had a beauty that went beyond her appearance, a grace that could not be taught, a light that could not be dimmed. The harem master soon favored her. Esther found favor with all who saw her. She did not seek to impress. She did not exalt herself. Her simplicity and discernment attracted attention in an environment where external brilliance was what mattered most. When the time came to present herself to the king, something extraordinary happened. King Xerxes looked at her and was enchanted. Among so many, he chose the young Esther to be his new queen. The throne, previously occupied by a woman who had said no, would now receive a woman prepared to say yes. But not a yes to the vanity of power, but to the divine purpose that was yet to be revealed. Mordecai followed everything closely, going every day to the palace gate to hear news of her. His heart was torn between care and trust, between fear and hope. He knew that something greater was being woven, and that somehow Esther was exactly where she was supposed to be. The orphan girl was now queen, but she was still Hadassah at heart. If this content is touching your heart, you can support this project by donating any amount by clicking on the "Thank you very much" button. Your support helps me to continue telling these stories with dedication. Even after Esther was crowned queen, Mordecai did not leave. He continued to walk every day to the palace gate, attentive, vigilant, silent. He did not seek recognition or a place in the palace. He only watched over the one he had raised as his daughter. His daily steps, his constant presence, seemed routine to many. But it was exactly there, in that place of passage and vigilance, that something decisive happened. One day, while standing by the gates, Mordecai heard voices conspiring. Two of the king's eunuchs, Bigtha and Teresh, guards of the royal chambers, were plotting in secret against King Xerxes himself. They spoke with hatred, and their words carried the dark intention of murder. Mordecai, upon hearing the conversation, did not hesitate. He knew he had to act urgently, but also wisely. He immediately informed Esther, who was inside the palace. The queen, in turn, brought the complaint to the king, making it clear that the information came from Mordecai. An investigation was conducted in secret, and everything was confirmed. The two men were executed, and the case was recorded in the royal books of the empire's history. However, something curious happened. Mordecai received no honors, rewards, or recognition. No medal, no position, no public mention. The heroic act of saving the king was only recorded as if it were just another detail in the routine of the kingdom. But in God's eyes, nothing had been forgotten. Mordecai's name was now engraved in the royal records, and more importantly, it was being woven into a divine plan that had not yet been revealed. It was like a seed sown in the soil of history, which would sprout at the right time. For Mordecai, the lack of applause did not matter. His heart was at rest in doing what was right, and he returned, day after day, to the same gate with the same steady steps and the same watchful gaze. Between the corridors of power and the walls of Susa, Something greater was coming, and that silent gesture of loyalty would soon be the thread that would untie the knots of an even more dangerous conspiracy. As time passed, a man named Haman was exalted in the Persian Empire. King Xerxes promoted him to a position above all other princes, granting him honor and authority. Wherever he went, people bowed down, prostrating themselves before him as if he were worthy of worship. Haman reveled in each bow. His heart swelled with pride, fueling a growing desire for absolute power. But there was one man who would not bow down. Mordecai, faithful to his faith and the teachings of his people, refused to bow down before Haman, not out of rebellion but out of conviction. He knew to whom he owed honor, and it would not be to a man full of vanity that he would render his reverence. Haman noticed, first with curiosity, then with contempt, finally with hatred. When he learned that Mordecai was a Jew, his contempt turned into something darker. It was not enough to punish that man. Haman wanted to eliminate the entire people to which he belonged. It was as if Mordecai's faithfulness had exposed something that Haman could not bear, the existence of a faith that did not bow to human power. Driven by this hatred, Haman devised a cruel plan. He cast lots, the pur, to choose the date of destruction. Then he approached the king with subtle and treacherous words. He said that there was a people scattered throughout the empire with different laws who did not obey the king's orders, and he suggested that they all be exterminated. The king, without investigating, trusted Haman. He gave him the royal ring, allowing him to decree whatever he wished. Thus, the death edict was written. In every corner of the kingdom, messengers brought the same news. On a set date, all Jews, young, old, women and children, would be killed. It was an irreversible sentence. Haman celebrated. He sat down to drink with the king, satisfied. But in Susa and throughout the empire there was astonishment, confusion and weeping. Evil had been decreed with the royal seal. Silence was no longer an option. One man's loyalty had aroused the fury of an empire. And now the survival of an entire people was at risk. The sound of trumpets and the galloping of messengers spread terror throughout the empire. The royal decree, sealed with the king's ring, had been proclaimed. On a certain date, all Jews would be exterminated. There would be no escape. Children, women, the elderly, no one would be spared. The silence of the streets gave way to weeping, and the ground of Susa was watered with tears. Mordecai, upon learning of the decree, tore his clothes in mourning. He dressed in sackcloth and covered himself with ashes. He cried out loudly in the streets, in a pain that could no longer be contained. His soul bled for his people. He was not just an observer, he was a living part of what was being threatened. And at that moment, he decided he would not remain silent. He came to the palace gate weeping, but he could not enter dressed that way. Still he remained there, in full view of everyone, as a living cry of indignation and despair. Other Jews throughout the empire did the same. They fasted, wept, and cried out. The decree had touched the heart of the nation, and the collective groaning rose like a cry to the heavens. Esther, isolated in the palace, did not know what was happening. When she learned of Mordecai's condition, she sent clothes for him to change into and enter, but he refused. It was not about appearance. It was about truth. It was time to act, not to hide. So, through messengers, Mordecai sent the truth to Esther. He explained the decree, exposed Haman's plan, and begged her to intercede before the king. Esther, however, hesitated. She knew that no one could appear before the king without being summoned, not even the queen. To do so was to risk her own life. But Mordecai did not back down. His response was clear and firm. It was not time to hide behind the palace walls. God could act in other ways, yes, but perhaps it was precisely because of that moment that Esther had been placed where she was. The time for silence was over. Amid tears, rags, and courageous words, hope began to dawn. The people needed a miracle, and God was about to act through an ordinary woman with an extraordinary calling. Mordecai's words echoed in Esther's heart with the weight of a divine calling. He'd said that even if she remained silent, deliverance would come from another place. But who knows if it wasn't for a time like this that she had become queen. It wasn't just an appeal, it was a call to courage. Esther felt she could no longer hide. Faced with the unthinkable, she made a decision. She asked Mordecai to gather all the Jews in Susa to fast for her for 3 days and 3 nights. She herself would do the same with her maids. No food, no water, only prayer, silence, and supplication. It was not just a strategy, it was total surrender, spiritual preparation for what was to come. Esther knew the risk. Appearing before the king without being summoned could mean her death. Even as queen, Persian law did not protect her from such boldness, but her response was firm. "I will go before the king, even if it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." It was the surrender of a lifetime for the love of her people. As the days of fasting passed, Susa remained tense. Mordecai, along with the other Jews, fasted with his face to the ground, waiting, trusting. Time dragged on like a thread suspended between fear and faith. At the end of 3 days, Esther dressed in royal robes. Not just a costume, but a symbol that she recognized the place where God had placed her. She walked through the palace corridors with a firm but calm heart. Each step was a prayer, each breath an act of courage. As she entered the king's courtyards, silence fell. All eyes turned to her. Esther stood still, waiting for the gesture that would decide her fate. The king saw her, and in an unexpected gesture, he extended his golden scepter to her. She had found favor in his eyes. Esther approached. She was no longer just a young Jewish orphan. She was a woman ready to intercede. The first battle was won, but the real fight was yet to begin. Esther, now before the king, did not immediately reveal her petition. Instead, with cunning and calm, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet. The king, curious and delighted, accepted the invitation. Haman, for his part, felt honored. Being called to an intimate meal with the king and queen further increased his pride. He thought himself untouchable, invincible, but he did not know that the thread of his power was already beginning to unravel. After the first banquet, the king asked Esther what her request was, but she only invited them to a second banquet the following day. Something was being prepared in silence, behind the scenes of divine providence. Meanwhile, Haman left the palace inflated with vanity until he saw Mordecai again, standing, unshaken, without bowing. Furious, Haman returned home and, encouraged by his wife and friends, had a gallows built about 60 feet high. There, he planned to hang Mordecai the next day. It was his ultimate revenge. He believed that nothing could stop him, but that same night, while Susa slept, the king lost sleep. Restless, he ordered the book of the Chronicles of the Kingdom to be brought to him. And there, in the lines that may have been forgotten, he found the account of how Mordecai had exposed the conspiracy that saved his life. The king then asked, "What honor was given to this man?" The answer came, "None." The next morning, Haman entered the royal courts to request Mordecai's execution. But before he could speak, the king interrupted him. What should be done to the man whom the king wishes to honor? Thinking that the king was referring to him, Haman suggested a grand honor, royal robes, the king's horse, a parade through the city. The king then commanded, "Go quickly and do this for Mordecai the Jew." Haman was forced to lead the man he hated through the streets of Susa, proclaiming his honor. It was the beginning of his downfall. That night, during the second banquet, Esther revealed her people and her identity to the king. She said, with courage and tears, that she and her people were condemned to death. The king, furious, asked, "Who did this?" And Esther replied, "The adversary is this wicked Haman." Haman was dragged away and, ironically, hanged on the same gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. With Haman's death, silence fell for a moment over the palace of Susa. But the death decree against the Jews still remained in force. Persian law did not allow a royal edict to be revoked, even if its author was dead. The danger had not passed. The clock of destruction continued to tick. Esther returned to the king's presence, this time weeping before him, pleading for her people. The pain she had kept inside until then exploded in intercession. The king again extended his scepter and heard her petition. Esther asked that Mordecai and she be granted the right to write a new decree, a text that would allow the Jews to defend themselves on the day set for their annihilation. The king agreed. He gave Mordecai the royal ring, the same one that had previously been in Haman's hands, and with it, authority. The man who had once walked through the palace gates now assumed a place of power and honor. Mordecai wrote a new edict, authorizing the Jews to organize, arm themselves, and defend their lives, families, and possessions. The new decree was sent to all the provinces of the empire, in all languages, reaching even the most distant corners. When the Jews received the new message, their lament gave way to joy. Hope was reborn where there had been only fear. The day that was marked for destruction became, for God's people, a day of resistance and victory. When the time came, the Jews united, resisted those who attacked them, and triumphed with dignity. The terror that Haman intended to spread fell upon his own followers. Mordecai, now elevated to the position of prime minister, became respected and admired throughout the kingdom. He dressed in royal robes, blue and white, with a large golden crown, but none of that changed him. He remained the same man of integrity, guided by faith, moved by compassion and zeal for his people. The Jewish people instituted a new celebration, Purim, in memory of their deliverance. It was a feast born of pain, transformed into salvation. An eternal reminder that God, even in silence, does not abandon his own. And Mordecai, the righteous man who did not bow down, became a symbol of hope for all generations. Mordecai's story was not written in the halls of power, but among the rubble of exile, in the alleys of silent faithfulness, and in the simple acts of those who decided to remain steadfast even when everything around them seemed to bow down. He did not seek greatness. He did not aspire to titles. What moved him was faithfulness to the God of his fathers, a faithfulness that withstood time, oppression, and danger. Mordecai did not bow down before Haman because he had already bowed down before God. And those who bow down before the Eternal One do not surrender to the vanity of men. His life teaches us that there are times when the steadfastness of one person can sustain the hope of many, and that courage is often born in silence, in anonymity, in the heart that chooses to do what is right, even when no one applauds. He also teaches us the power of investing in the next generation. By raising Esther as his daughter, Mordecai not only gave her shelter, but shaped a queen with eternal values. His silent influence paved the way for the deliverance of an entire nation. His wisdom taught that to educate is to plant seeds of salvation. In the days when evil seemed to triumph, Mordecai remained steadfast. When the death decree was sealed, he wept, yes, but he also took action. He sought God, exhorted Esther, and fasted with his people. It was active faith, which neither settles nor hides, that turned a death sentence into a celebration of life. And when he was finally exalted, he remained faithful. Power did not corrupt him. Honor did not change him. He continued to serve with justice, being a comfort to his people and a light among the nations. Today, we are invited to follow the example of this righteous man who faced an empire with the strength of integrity. In times of persecution, his story reminds us that God does not abandon those who trust in him. When evil seems to prevail, the Lord is already preparing the turnaround. And when the heavens seem silent, he is still at work, in small acts of faithfulness, in silent prayers, in hidden deeds. Mordecai's life calls us to courage, to not bow down, to stand firm, confident that the God who saved an entire people through one righteous man still reigns supreme. If you enjoyed the story of Mordecai and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.